Dr. Anat Caspi is the director of the Taskar Center for Accessible Technology, whose mission is to develop technology that improves the quality of life for individuals with diverse mobility and speech abilities. She's currently helping evolve and scale the inclusive design curriculum at the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. She received a master's in computer science at Stanford and a PhD in bioengineering from the joint graduate group at UC Berkeley in San Francisco. And she's the 2017 recipient of the Northwest Access Fund Innovation Award, recognizing her contribution in development of products that have improved the quality of life for individuals with disability in the Pacific Northwest region. With that, I'm excited to hear what she has to say about making sidewalks more accessible.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, so as Tim said, my name is Anat Caspi. I am the director of the Taskar Center for Accessible Technology. Thank you so much for having me here today. I wanted to talk about equitable access to urban environments, and in particular, how open data about pedestrian spaces can really enhance and improve engagement in urban communities and environments for everyone. Specifically, sidewalk navigation is really essential to vibrant and sustainable cities, and sidewalks really make up the fabric of urban life. Every commuter, whether they're arriving at a healthcare appointment or walking to her car, arriving home from a bus station, or even commuting from one mode of transportation to another, uses sidewalks to connect different modes and different ways of commuting. And so a little bit about the Taskar Center for Accessible Technology is, as Tim mentioned, we are working on developing translatable technologies to improve independence and quality of life for individuals with disabilities. But really, our design process is focused on co-designing with communities of practice. And as such, we believe that participatory design really enables us to design for the fullness of human experience. So while our focus is communities with disabilities, we open our participatory design processes to be inclusive for everyone. So we started out by addressing the needs of one population. This is the 54.5 million individuals in the US that require assistive mobility devices or have trouble walking more than a quarter mile, as they self-proclaim in the census. And digital cartography and routing currently seems to marginalize this population because it does not take into account specific pedestrian needs that they might have. While technology has really made a transformative difference in our ability to access data that allows us to tackle daily needs, in particular with automobile use, and certainly somewhat with public transportation as we have more and more multimodal routing capabilities. The first and last mile have really been somewhat marginalized when it comes to pedestrian ways. Many of us have come to really depend on our smartphones for navigating the city, but unlike cars, humans present a heterogeneous informational gap when we approach the environment. Whereas a car might have a specific need for a road to be paved and be of a specific width, as humans, we have very different needs when we are coming to the environment, dependent on our personal needs and abilities. So in this example, I mapped in Google Directions, starting point at the University Station of the Light Rail and ending at the Electrical Engineering building at the University of Washington. And I'm presented with several routes and and the way of comparing among them have to do with the time it might take me to arrive at my destination. However, first, my ability may not actually conform to the homogeneous model that's applied here, so maybe I won't quite make it at those times. The other problem is that information that might be really important to me is not represented. And I've put in the annotation of stairs where those might be met, as well as gravel road where it might be difficult to wheel about. One of the important facets of this is that the actual most accessible route is not represented here, which would be the along the sidewalks along Stevens Way. And so one facet, as I said, is that different informational attributes of the environment are not sufficiently represented to allow me to make informed decisions about which route to choose. The other aspect of this is that sidewalks are not actually treated as part of a transportation network. And while footpaths are represented, where there are sidewalks that are sidewalks along an automobile route, I have no way of adjudicating among the sides of the sidewalk, the sides of the street that might be better for me to use. And so what we really didn't realize before we started on this project is that many applications don't use sidewalk data at all. Instead, they operate using car-centric road data, and as a result, millions of people don't have the information that they might need in order to get around. So we believe that addressing the needs of the specific subpopulation that we started with actually stands to highlight the needs of a much larger swath of the population and stands to improve routing supports for everyone. And I'd also like to point out that we all have potential situational needs that may be fulfilled by these objectives. Once in a while, I'm wheeling about a sidewalk, or I might be pushing a delivery cart. We hear a lot from our users that people who push strollers love to use our app because it informs them about the environment in ways that other applications do not. Additionally, there are times in our lives where we might have these circumstances that make us require more information about the environment. However, access to that kind of information about sidewalks and as they relate to our personal ability seems to be lacking. And in 2015, the National Council on Disability noted that they really could not find comprehensive information on the degree to which sidewalks are accessible across the US. And this lack of information can have obviously significant negative impact on the independence and mobility of all people. So the problem we're addressing is that street level accessibility fundamentally affects where and how people travel in cities and what opportunities they have access to. And while the infrastructure problems are ones that we can't really attempt to solve here, we're able to bridge some of the informational gap which exists as people cannot determine whether their personal access to an area before they arrive would enable them to travel and traverse there. So today I'd like to talk to you about our solution to personalized pedestrian routing. And that will launch us into another project about mapping pedestrian infrastructure and how we can remain pedestrian-centric in the way that we map the environment and built environment. The OpenSidewalks project is what we've named our project, and I'll talk a little bit about more on the open data and shared data structure that we're promoting, and then talk about other downstream applications for this pedestrian-centric data and the non-motorized mobility models that we've used to create the personalized pedestrian routing application. So for personalized pedestrian routing, we have called our app AccessMap.io, and it's widely available. Right now, it focuses on Seattle-specific data. And TCAT really focuses on participatory design practices, as I mentioned, and as such, we create and engage a number of communities of practice who co-design with us. And so one of our participants had the following to say: using a tool like directions on Google Maps doesn't really help me get around. Actually, sometimes this does more harm than good. I'm sent down streets I cannot cross or up inclines that are impossible to climb. It can be deeply frustrating. And in some cases, it can actually turn around a travel plan. And we've seen this in a number of the participants that we've talked to, and also now that we're able to track the usage of our app in practice, how people are actually following the routes that we're suggesting to them, we see a number of turnarounds. So the bottom line is each of us experiences the environment differently. And while I'm highlighting mobility limitations, there are multitudes of needs out there that can have different informational requirements. For example, I can be severely allergic. And so different seasons of the year might make me more inclined to choose different paths that don't have me crossing tree-lined streets, for example. And so you can imagine multitudes of uses where if we have the underlying pedestrian transportation network, we're able to imbue it with different attributes that relate to different informational needs that our consumers might need. And I do want to highlight that even though we're addressing personalized needs, this doesn't mean that personalized routing will only benefit individual consumers. In the past 3 years that we've been following this path, we've found many more stakeholders, and some of them have actually contacted us because they require the ability to custom route to individuals or to groups of individuals that have particular personal profiles of mobility around the environment. And some of these would be private businesses and transportation agencies that have ADA compliance responsibilities, and they might be asking whether accessible paths to specific locations or specific transit stops actually exist for a particular mobility profile, particular visual impairment, etc. Another use has to do with city and urban planners and whether they are actually taking into account specific personal profiles or characteristics when they prioritize accessibility infrastructure investments. And while a lot of these investments are reactive, cities like to show that the investments that they make will make a larger impact in certain contexts. And what we're able to do once we have these personalized mobility profiles is look at accessibility bottlenecks across a much larger area or portions of the environment. So the requirement for deploying this kind of personalized routing algorithm seem to be rather simple. And there really are major two requirements. First is we have to be able to fully express the underlying transportation graph as a connected graph. So whereas the panel on the left shows individual segments A and B of sidewalks, what we really would like to see is sidewalks represented as edges, and the nodes that connect them represent the fact that they can be connected. Now, when we go from node to node or through edges, in reality, we're going through sidewalks in space. Additionally, we need to add attributes to the graph nodes and edges, and those attributes will label the different attributes that are important to individuals as they mobilize about the environment. So they might label slope, they might label construction, other features like attributes that either improve access or might be deleterious to it. In either way, those attributes will affect the mobility along those sidewalk paths. Once those requirements are satisfied, then we can optimally identify the best personal path that uses a multivariable cost function. So what we're doing is taking a particular transportation network and then applying a personalized non-motorized mobility profile of a specific individual and being able to cost their traversal through space using a multivariable cost function. And what's shown is an example right here, whereas A is, I believe, a building next door at Google, and B is reaching somewhere across 45th Street. And what we're seeing is that the optimized path for that particular mobility profile is not necessarily the shortest path, but looks at elevation change as a primary aspect of the environment that I'd like to minimize my elevation incline that I traverse. So I did want to show a live demo, but before that, I'll say that we started out building AccessMap as an aggregated map. Let's just put all the attributes for a mobility limited individual in one place, because the people that we surveyed look at a number of different resources in order to even be able to assess whether they'd be able to access a particular environment. They use Google Street View, they use other kinds of resources, elevation maps, in order to kind of walk through the space virtually and be able to assess whether it's possible for them to access that. But this is a really long and arduous process. Oftentimes it's done at home through a desktop computer. Some have even reported a 4-hour walkthrough in order to assess whether they'd be able to access from the bus station to City Hall, for example, in order to perform daily business. And so what I'd like to do okay. So there's AccessMap. It's a little bit difficult to see on the screen, but you can see that we've used certain visual metaphors to indicate the, maybe I'll increase the size here. So each sidewalk is represented differentially and has a color that might indicate what its incline might be. And I'm able to then click on that in order to tell me what the actual steepness for that would be. Likewise, we are also indicating crossings. And when both sides of the crossings have a curb ramp, we indicate that in the darker gray. Now, downtown Seattle actually is fairly well endowed with curb ramps, but you can see some instances where the crossings are light gray, and that would indicate that one or both of the curb ramps are not present. Lastly, we indicate construction information on the basis of permit information that's open data in the city of Seattle's open data endpoints. And so that's just the information that's there. One thing that you can really see visually by just inspecting the city is just the vertical inclination from the ocean side up towards the freeway. You can see the red line markings in this direction and the fairly light markings in this direction. Another thing I'd like to highlight is that I can specify my personal mobility. So while we have some canonical mobility profiles for manual chair, power chair, and other device users, you can also indicate your own uphill incline maximum. For example, I will say that mine is 5.6. And so that will change the coloring of the inclines along the different sidewalks on the basis of what the elevation change would be there. Now, one thing that we're still struggling with is how to gather this kind of information from the UI perspective for people, because nobody comes to you and says, oh yeah, my personal mobility limitation is at 5.4%. Great. And so we've found alternative ways to gather that kind of information from people, but I won't actually talk about that today. And so then we introduced routing. For example, setting the origin at the Rainier Club and trying to get to this destination will send me further out than the shortest path, but it will allow me to go downhill at a rate that might be more comfortable for me. If I'm wheeling downhill, it would certainly be uncomfortable to go down Seneca Street, which is quite steep. And I believe University Steep along here has stairs as well. So we're avoiding some of those obstacles, which our map is aware of. Great. So let's talk a little bit about our user base and what happened when we actually introduced routing, because we had just the aggregate map available for about 1.5 years before we enabled routing. So looking at usage by age actually kind of surprised us. We anticipated having fewer aging individuals and somewhat of a more equitable use between males and females. And this is probably partly due to our communities of practice and who we engaged in this first release. But we're trying to improve upon this greatly. Another aspect that was important to us was what were the platforms that were accessing this information. And the reason that's important is, as I mentioned, our initial usability studies really identified the fact that people are planning at home. A lot of this pre-planning takes place at home on desktop computing for a longer term. And so the sessions would be very long. And one of the questions that we're trying to address is whether having these kinds of routing algorithms available would allow people to actually route on the fly, doing things in a more spontaneous way, and potentially, from our perspective, engaging in community access more readily because they feel confident with the information that's available to them. So let's say I'm done with my business downtown. Might I go find a friend in a coffee shop nearby and be able to confidently, independently route to that location? And so what we were looking to see was whether there's any transition between desktop use to mobile use after we've introduced the routing algorithms. And indeed, we actually found a rather significant change in that realm. The initial aggregated map was available between June of 2015 to the January of 2017, and saw really a predominant use across desktop users. And then afterwards, once automated routing was introduced, we see a dramatic shift into mobile computing. And that's not to say that that's an absolute indicator. Of course, people can be using mobile tablets at home, but we did see this shift, and we're going to inquire further into the details here. So what contributed to the really long lag time for providing automated routing? Like, we were hoping to do this within a month or two of the aggregated map, and clearly that was not happening. This really had to do with the lack of underlying pedestrian transportation graph that I talked about earlier. So taking data from the City of Seattle's Department of Transportation, we found that there were egregious errors in the location of sidewalks and really very little information about their connectivity. So the City of Seattle's data is actually not that bad by comparison to other cities. And yet we see a lot of what was happening there in the leftmost panel, where you have these dangling ends and really inaccurate GPS locations of where sidewalk ends might be. And we were really quite surprised that to find that all of the major mappers didn't have any individual representations of sidewalk segments that were not just attributes of the car-specific roads. So looking across OpenStreetMaps, TomTom's, Google Maps as well, we found this lack of explicit representation for sidewalks as entities. Finally, when we're looking at agencies and municipalities in particular who either need or are required by law to maintain this kind of information, these stakeholders might have the sidewalk information, but it's all in these asset management systems. So you can think of these as like Excel spreadsheets with line items for every sidewalk segment. It might detail to you when it was last patched up or some permit was awarded in 1934, but it doesn't actually give you the accurate GPS locations or how they're connected to other sidewalk segments. And so they're not really held in any type of standard format either, because every municipality chooses its own asset management system. And so being able to launch AccessMap again in another city, even Kirkland or Bellevue, we would have to go back to square one, essentially, and be able to do all of our error correction all over again, because every data collection had its own biases and nuances that we had to learn for every municipality. And so none of this was really translatable, but we were able to finally do it for one city over the span of a year and a half. Lastly, there is that connectivity problem where the underlying graph would still need to be inferred and validated in order to result in some kind of transportation network that allows us to do what happens here on the right, which is take the raw data, be able to estimate some kind of error correction, redraw and annotate the entire transportation network, and then you're finally able to allow people both trip planning and sufficient analytics so that they can understand what's the environment on the ground looking like. And so our project actually really quickly transformed into promoting this standardized sidewalk collection of pedestrian infrastructure in a pedestrian-centric manner. And in order to explicitly express a personalized cost function on the right, we have to take into account a really huge variety of needs. So whereas the workflow is shown on the left, where the user specifies their own preferences, we are then able to calculate the personal cost for traveling along a sidewalk, given the sidewalk attributes, right? So the costing function is actually conditioned upon both the individual for whom we're routing as well as the attributes of the environment. And finally, the algorithm itself optimizes for the best path given those preferences, not specifically time or distance or some subjective accessible information that other users might have contributed. What are some of these heterogeneous needs that might be represented in the personalized cost function? Well, we have to take a lot of things into account. People use white canes, manual wheelchairs, power wheelchairs, crutches, scooters, walking canes, legs, and add to that different athletic ability, right? You have this hugely heterogeneous underlying cost function. And what we really had to do is start prioritizing what it is that we collect in our standard data set in order to be able to supply people with personalized routing. So initially, we really just prioritized on the connectivity information. Where are the sidewalks? Where are the street crossings? Where are the off-street paths? And are there curb ramps to connect all of these? And it is really best to map for detailed, accurate facts with very little subjective interpretation. And while there are some standards like wheelchair standard width, these standards are not necessarily international. And what we find is that the built environment standards do not really exist. For example, as more and more cities, even Seattle, are equipping their streets with bicycle lanes, two-way bicycle lanes, pedestrian islets, all of these make the process of mapping for accessibility really difficult and ambiguous. So it is much better to provide very accurate, detailed information about the physical attributes of the environment and measurements that could then be used to determine the accessibility for a particular individual. And so while I'm not trying to highlight faults in the Google Scout program, it's using the subjective patterns of wheelchair accessible is actually rather not useful to me when I wheel my daughter around in a mobility stroller, which happens to be 2 inches wider than the standard wheelchair. None of the information that's collected by Scouts for wheelchair accessibility, which specifies 36 inches wide, matters to me when I'm looking at whether it's accessible to my 38-inch wide chair. And so it's going to be more and more subjective as we go forward. And the idea is to really map for accurate physical information. So static data ought to be precisely detailed. There are also ways in which transient information can really impact cost functions for different individuals. And this information might be temporarily persistent, or it might be patterned across seasons, like we mentioned before, or across daily patterns of crowdedness, for example, or noise, things of that nature. So many times the accessibility of a location is conditioned on some kind of transient property, like noise, or crowdedness, or when it's raining, the surface type that might be known to be brick is more likely to be slick when it's raining. And so being able to provide that kind of conditional costing is also important. And that's why we want to collect transient information. Hopefully, as more and more cities are collecting sensed environment data with IoT, et cetera, we're able to provide more and more of these functions. And so we're advocating for specific metrics or probability distributions of particular occurrences of these transient information. So in summary, we're prioritizing pedestrian-centric data where connectivity is of high value and the location of the attributes are extremely important. And then we can add features that are representing either potential barriers or assistive infrastructure with very precise detail and measurements. And another reason to do this in a very precise manner is because sometimes what might be a potential barrier to some subclass of people may actually be enhancing as an assistive infrastructure for others. An example of this is when we were mapping the Judkins Park area, which has quite a population of assistive pedestrian signals. We find that some of those are located smack in the middle of the curb ramp, which might be prohibitive for wheelchair users. And so the exact location and specific attributes of where infrastructure might be is really important for mobility and personalized mobility. So we called our project OpenSidewalks, and this was a joint venture with the eScience Institute. And the idea is really to democratize pedestrian way data. So not only are we promoting the standardization of sidewalk data and sidewalks as entities, we really would hope for this to be an open data and have shared resources that use open source software. And what we're promoting across our developer communities is developing different software for agencies to enable vetting and validation of the data that they're willing to receive from the open shared commons, right? So not everybody needs to accept all the contributions that someone might make into an open data commons, but there ought to be ways to automate the vetting process so that it's not an arduous vetting of every single data point. And this allows us to make a number of innovations in pedestrian technology and really promote some public-private partnerships. The model that we're shown here is quite complicated. What we're seeing on the bottom is really the commons. So you have the contribution of different agencies, whether they be government agencies or private agencies, and then there are the processing algorithms that allow different agencies to critically vet the information that they're willing to receive. And that pedestrian geodata can go into the creation of a routing graph where you have different costing functions that are applied when an end user, which is the box at the top, the one shown at the top might be AccessMap, but as I'll talk about, there are other derivative applications that can make similar uses of the data commons on the bottom. So the biggest questions were clearly there are multiple stakeholders, but who houses this type of data and who wants to commonly make the developer community access that kind of information? And so our wonderful partnership with the OpenStreetMap community really allowed us to introspectively look at the data standard that we were promoting and look to see whether we're going to actually break some of the other algorithms that are commonly used on top of OpenStreetMap data, which has been very auto-centric till now. So the OpenStreetMap community is kind of the Wikipedia of maps. I'm not going to wait through the entire video here, but what we're looking at is the contributions to OpenStreetMap, which started in 2006. And the nice attributes of OpenStreetMap to this is that they have an extensible data model and detailed statistic information that's allowing us to look at how much of the contribution and how much of the auto-centric data actually contains sidewalk information. Most importantly, it is easily modifiable by both communities as well as entire municipalities. So right now we're working with the city of San Jose to import their entire sidewalk data set, for example. There we go. So the full contribution by 2016 is pretty much the entire developed world, and people are working very hard on incorporating the less developed world and lower resources countries as well. So what it meant for us is that we needed to find a way to access these crowdsourcing communities and be able to incorporate our data model into their practices. So we've taken a lot of the infrastructure that's already there and leveraged it in order to promote pedestrian-centric information. This meant looking at Mapathon infrastructure. So we're using the tasking manager that basically parcels out entire communities into bite-sized chunks that people can undertake in the span of one afternoon. Looking at so we've created specialized sidewalk editors that really promote the tags that we have gotten accepted through the community. We've also made use of field papers, which are the very lowest tech kind of contributions, but allow people who are in aging communities and are less inclined to use the high-tech resources to also help us in mapping. We're then able to scan their contributions and digitize that into the map. And then finally, we've offered some gamified quests and challenges, which have had the largest uptakes in communities like Safe Routes to Schools, where kids really like to challenge each other with competitive map quests and mapping abilities. But those are all active data collection, which means that we all have to get together, decide that we'll spend the whole afternoon mapping. And that's still, while there are communities out there, that's still somewhat of a big ask. And so what we're seeing here is some of the mapathons that we've run and some of the sidewalk promoting editors that we've created. But there ought to also be some passive or semi-passive ways to collect this kind of data. After all, people are walking on sidewalks. We ought to just be able to sense that. And so we've provided some mobile applications that enable us to do that when people consent to us gathering that kind of information. So we're looking at GPS traces of where people are walking. We're able to infer the sidewalk locations by being able to infer what modality of transportation they're using. And we're using the accelerometer, magnetometer, and gyroscope data to also infer where the crappy sidewalks are. Where are they bumpy and how long, for what stretches of road is it bumpy? And we can deem these like lower quality sidewalks. Likewise, we can record the inclines and confer that the data that we have about elevation changes are true. And then there are also some semi-passive ways of collecting that kind of data, which means somebody, for example, using imagery. So in this instance, I'm showing Mapillary, which is a company based in Australia that have partnered with us. They're essentially the crowdsourced Street View, so individuals are collecting this kind of sidewalk information, and they might be taking imagery in a number of different devices. And so this is kind of my first potential ask if I was to make one. The reason we do not promote the use of Google Street View imagery in order to validate some of the mapping information is because of the licensing of derivative products from Google Street View. And so the OpenStreetMap community has really deprecated the use of Google Street View because of the licensing issue and some of the potential legislative issues that have to do with validating and vetting information about the environment. And it would be really wonderful if we could not do that, because as you all know, Google has deployed a really standardized way and devices of collecting this kind of data. So when we use computer vision on the Mapillary imagery, because of the lack of standardization across the different mobile devices that are used to collect this data, we're not typically able to actually attribute correct GPS locations to the items that we identify in the imagery. So even if I know the GPS location of the person taking the image, which is also fraught with a lot of error because mobile devices don't typically have very accurate GPS locations, then the ability to identify that there's a sign over there won't necessarily allow me to detect where specifically it is. And so mapping it on OpenStreetMap is fraught with a lot of potential error. And we'd like to avoid that. Whereas the kinds of devices and standardization that's been applied with the Google Street View imagery is much more conducive to accurate GPS localization of the attributes that we find. So as far as other potential downstream uses for pedestrian-centric data, as well as the non-motorized travel models that we've deployed, we look again at the personal routing application. So again, the costing function is really conditioned upon the individual looking at the environment and the environment itself and having sufficient data that's collected about the attributes of that built environment. And so the data isn't necessarily there, but should be, and we can actually put it there now because we have a huge plethora of sense data, and everyone will benefit. And then you can't necessarily determine the accessibility of the environment without mapping that kind of detailed, accurate information. But what we've seen is that a lot of the tools already exist and that we can collect this data fairly easily using a variety of means, using both contributions from crowds as well as contributions from public and private entities. And so leveraging the crowd means that we're able to then modify and maintain the data on a much more ready basis, because typically the times that municipalities are collecting sidewalk data is in a reactive legislative manner. Seattle just redid its entire sidewalk inventory because of the result of a lawsuit that had an ADA complaint associated with it. But typically speaking, there aren't the resources out there to maintain the data on an ongoing basis. And so the crowd contributions with appropriate community developed vetting algorithms can really allow us to maintain this data set on an ongoing basis. And also contribute to civic engagement and community engagement with your place. So the data commons contribution and consumption allows us to really construct this infrastructure that promotes open data repositories. And as we think they are ready for use in production and can be used to coordinate between and amongst stakeholders that haven't really exchanged information in the past. And one of the reasons they have not exchanged information in the past is because different stakeholders have different access to private information, and some of the attributes that they have might be in aggregate really contributing to this kind of data repository, but then they're unable to respect the responsibility of the privacy of the data that they gather. And what we're promoting is that community developed resources can really adjudicate and perform the aggregation that's necessary in order to remove some of the privacy issues while still allowing the synchronization and contribution of the data to this larger collective. And the synchronization and propagation of changes can really be used as they happen on the ground. So maintenance has been a really big push for this. So one of the applications that I spoke about was AccessMap, and that's really about improved automated routing. Like I said, we've only used elevation changes and construction information and curb cuts because those were the data sets that were available to us with the highest density for the city of Seattle. However, what we're doing right now is really collecting a lot more of the data attributes so that we can incorporate a lot more of the personalized mobility challenges, vision impairment, other preferences, like I said, about pollution, toxicity, noise levels, things of that sort, that allow us to really challenge the environment in various ways by looking at specific mobility profiles of individuals and understanding how that might impact their access through the environment. And the challenges that still remain is the requirement of specific users' profiles, along with the complete dependency on the underlying connected sidewalk graph. Other tools that we've provided in our collaboration with Washington State DOT, their request was to define specific criteria for access and display bottlenecks due to specific features of the built environment. So what we're seeing here, unfortunately, the map layer is not really well shown. Starting at Seattle Center as a starting point, and holding constant to a manual chair mobility profile, what are all the street corners that are accessible via a curb ramp? So what we see is the swath of the area with some accessibility islands. And then there are boundaries in every direction. And so as an urban planner, you might choose to connect Seattle Center with Queen Anne. And so you might be interested in providing curb ramps in a particular direction or another. We can also, and we have, crossed this information with ORCA information in terms of where ORCA cards transfers take the most place. And so we're able to see where people make their commute transfers, and transit agencies might be willing and able to look at the walk sheds around their transit agents and their transit stops in order to promote more accessibility features along the most commonly used transfers and transfer routes. And lastly, this has been one of our most successful end uses of this kind of data, which was used for pedestrian advocacy with the Seattle Commission for People with Disabilities, who came to us. Well, we partnered with them along the way, but they really wanted to be able to see the change in the environment for a manual chair user when public accessible building elevators are available in downtown Seattle, which directly translates to the ability to enter on 3rd Avenue, traverse through an indoor building environment, take the elevator up to 4th Avenue level and emerge out there. So that means that you didn't have to go across a really high elevation change of, I believe, something like 9.8% grade or something, which is difficult for me on certain days, you know. And so what we're looking at here are these accessibility isochrones, where the same color indicates that there's approximately the same level of difficulty of traversal. So again, this is a composite multivariable cost function that takes into account the elevation change, the travel distance, the potential travel time, along with some of the curb cut information. And what we're seeing is that once buildings open at 8 or 9 a.m. in the morning, suddenly the terrain completely changes for a potential manual wheelchair user. And so using this kind of infographic, the Commission for People with Disabilities went to the city of Seattle's DOT and said, we really need to work on advocating for building owners to open up their buildings in the off hours and weekends so that we can offer this kind of accessibility in downtown Seattle to everybody across different times of the day. Another application that we're looking at and have worked on recently have to do with opening up digital cartography for people with vision impairment. We have not yet found the visual modality that allows us to offer this on a digital interface. But as far as being able to personally, independently manufacture your own tactile maps based on the context of your travel, as well as the most up-to-date information about the pedestrian space, one would be able to go to the Tactile Maptile website and request the maps surrounding a very particular location. And what you get is a 3D model that you're then able to take to a local library or send to a 3D printing manufacturing agency that would be able to send it to you for a couple of dollars as opposed to the thousands of dollars that these maps typically take. And one of the nice things, attributes of this project is that people really do get to personalize the tactile metaphors that are used to represent whatever it is that they're interested in. So if I'm traveling to a new city, I might request information about cafes and restaurants, whereas if I'm traveling by bus, I might want to know the information about transit stops and where they are located. And so a summary and a call to action. We've defined the data standards. We are really promoting sidewalks as entities in a dedicated connected pedestrian transportation layer. And we'd love to see this in an open shared pedestrian path data, which enables other downstream applications that might be very, very specific to specific subpopulations that could benefit from this kind of information. The open licensing of imagery derivative data would be fantastic. And again, we are really interested in the accurate, detailed information about the physical environment as well as the transient data, as opposed to somewhat more nebulous or subjective terms like accessible. Especially as we see more and more individuals using DIY accessibility devices of all kinds, because prototyping and manufacturing becomes so much easier nowadays. I believe this to be a very, very important aspect of mapping for accessibility. The attribution of wheelchair accessible does not really apply anymore, and that's what the Open Sidewalks project is promoting. And then finally, the participation in the data commons confers both contributions and benefits to all of the entities that are inclined to contribute that kind of data. So in closing, I'd like to thank you. And if you have any questions or would like to have more information, please do contact uw-tcat@uw.edu or the Taskar Center. Thank you.
If anyone here has questions, we got a few minutes.
3.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You'd mentioned that you had you'd mentioned that you had some other UIs sort of tested, or you were playing with different UIs for having users tell you what their needs are. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we really try to assess people's abilities on the basis of infrastructure that they're familiar with. So again, asking somebody, what's your personal best, is really a difficult question, and nobody can really answer that. Plus, it's a very temporary thing. Like today I'm feeling really great, and tomorrow not so much. However, people are actually motor conditioned to know, oh, today I can take the Yesler Hill, but yesterday I was unable to. And so we use communities that people are familiar with and traverse on a regular basis to ask them specific questions about their ability, and both personal maximal best and what's neutral to them.
I was curious, you talked about a lot of different ways you can get data. Which one has, or which ones have been the most successful and provided the most useful data for you? So like Mapathons versus online tools that people can contribute, or the kind of automated systems using GPS tracks, et cetera?
Yeah, so imports have been the most useful, especially imports from decent data sources. So certain municipalities have actually really decent data. Some of them may or may not use centerline data, which is how we represent sidewalks. And so some of these ways are more easy for us to conform to in our data standard than others. But doing entire city imports is really subject to the community that's willing to vet it. But it's a fairly quick process once it's imported. As opposed to being able to then collect specific, let's say, signaling information on the ground, which requires people to actually walk out and do this. And so that's been the slowest process.
How does the vetting work? So you're saying the cities or municipalities do the vetting themselves, or?
It depends. So in a city like San Jose, we have really, really motivated partners. And so they're doing the vetting pretty much on their own. In the city of Philadelphia, we have communities that are really interested. And so then we use the tasking manager in the sense of like we import the data and we parcel it out. So everybody's got just like a 1 or 2 block chunk that they're supposed to vet. And so you're able to kind of gamify some of this collection or make it a community competition or something like that. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much.